Camille Reese was 41 years old when her husband walked out of their marriage with a lawyer, a strategy, and 2 years of preparation she had never seen coming. She had been the kind of woman people described, without meaning to diminish her, steady, dependable. The one who kept the house and managed the budget and showed up to every obligation with the quiet reliability of someone who had decided long ago that her value was in her consistency. Her colleagues at the Atlanta branding firm where she worked as a senior copywriter called her meticulous. Her husband, Warren Reese, called her low maintenance, which she had once taken as a compliment and later understood as a warning about how he had always seen her. His friends called her plain Camille, and he never corrected them. He did not need to correct them. He was counting on them being right. When the divorce papers arrived, Warren's attorney had already positioned his assets, moved accounts, and restructured 2 shared investments into instruments that a standard discovery process would not easily locate. The settlement left Camille with the furniture, 1 car, and a checking account with $4,200 in it. Warren left with everything else, and a woman named Brooke, who wore the kind of watch that announced itself before she entered a room. What Warren had never thought to ask, not once in 9 years, was why a senior copywriter spent her lunch hours on calls she took outside the building. Or why a portfolio tucked in the back of the home filing cabinet had a law firm's return address on every page, or whose name was on the creative licensing agreements that had been quietly compounding since before she ever met him. 2 years after he left her with almost nothing, Warren Reese stood on a sidewalk in Midtown Manhattan and looked up. What he saw changed the shape of everything he thought he knew. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The year before Warren filed had been, on the surface, unremarkable. Camille rose at 5:30 every morning and made her coffee in the kitchen of the Decatur house she had chosen, and he had agreed to. The kitchen with the open shelving she had built herself one Saturday in October, measuring and sanding and sealing each board while Warren watched a game in the next room and called through the doorway that she didn't have to do it herself, they could hire someone. She had told him she liked doing it herself. He had said, "Suit yourself," and gone back to the game. She stood at those shelves now each morning and let the quiet of early hours settle into her the way her father had always said quiet should be used. Her father, Thomas Reese, had been a commercial illustrator for 30 years, the kind of man who could render a room in 15 minutes and a face in 5, and who believed that the ability to see something clearly was the most useful skill a person could develop. He had died 4 years ago, and she still heard him most mornings. He used to say, "Camille, the people who underestimate you are doing you a favor. They show you exactly what they are working with." She had been doing creative work since she was 19 years old. Copywriting led to brand consulting. Brand consulting led to a specialty in visual identity development. And somewhere along the way, she had begun creating original brand language and conceptual frameworks that she licensed rather than sold outright. It was quiet, methodical work. It did not look like wealth. It accumulated the way good work always did, in increments, in the background, in agreements drafted by her attorney and signed without ceremony, and filed away in a cabinet Warren had never opened. Only her attorney and her accountant knew the full picture. She had met Warren 11 years ago at an industry mixer in Buckhead, the kind of evening that smelled of sponsored wine and ambition in roughly equal measure. He had been in commercial real estate, sharp and sociable, the kind of man who worked a room with the ease of someone who had been doing it since childhood. He had found her in the corner near the window, which was where she always found herself at those events, and he had said, "You look like you are deciding whether any of this is worth your time." She had laughed and said, "I'm still deciding," he had said. "I'll wait." She had thought that was the most honest thing a man had said to her in months, and she had been wrong about what kind of honesty it was. The first years were good, or close enough to good that she had not examined the edges carefully. He was charming with her family and attentive in public, and spoke well of her work in the general way of a man who did not understand it, but understood that it was valued. The trouble began gathering in the margins somewhere around year 6, when his real estate business expanded, and his attention narrowed, and Brooke, who worked in his downtown office, began appearing in the background of photographs he posted on his business profile with increasing frequency. Camille had noticed. She had filed it without acting on it. She was a woman who gathered information before she drew conclusions. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday in March. It was thicker than she expected. She set it on the kitchen counter and stood looking at it for a long moment before she opened it. And when she did, she read every page of the divorce petition with the same deliberate attention she brought to every document that required a decision. She made coffee. She sat down. She read it again. Her face remained perfectly calm. The petition was calculated in ways that told her this had been planned for considerably longer than Warren had allowed her to believe. The asset schedule attached to it listed his holdings in a configuration she did not recognize from their shared financial life. 2 investment accounts she had known about were absent. A real estate partnership she had helped him fund in the early years had been restructured 12 months prior. The documentation filed in a county 3 hours away. A shared brokerage account had been drawn down to a nominal balance over a period of 16 months in transfers small enough to avoid automatic flags. She set the petition on the counter and went back through 9 years of what she thought she had known. She was a copywriter, which meant she had spent her career understanding that a message always had a structure underneath it, and that the structure told you more than the words did. She began applying that same logic to the financial architecture of her marriage, the way she applied it to any project. Start with what is visible. Then ask what is being obscured. Then ask why. She pulled 18 months of joint bank statements from the filing cabinet and spread them across the kitchen table. The pattern emerged in the first hour. Routine household transfers, properly sized and evenly spaced, gave way in month 7 to a series of smaller transfers in irregular amounts and intervals, the kind of rhythm that did not belong to a household budget and did belong to someone moving money with enough patience to avoid triggering automatic alerts. She counted them. 29 transfers over 14 months. She added them up on a notepad. She found the real estate partnership paperwork in a folder she had not opened in 2 years, because Warren had managed the documentation and she had trusted him to do it correctly. The restructuring documents were dated 14 months ago. Her name appeared on a transfer consent form she had no memory of signing, in handwriting that approximated hers without quite achieving it, the way a copy always fell slightly short of the original when you knew what to look for. She photographed every page with her phone and forwarded the images to a secure folder she kept on a cloud account whose password Warren had never asked about, and she had never offered. She moved with the same deliberate calm that had always defined her. She did not call him. She did not call a friend. She called her attorney. Her hands did not shake. Phyllis Okafor had practiced civil and family law in Atlanta for 24 years and kept an office in Midtown that was spare and orderly and smelled of nothing at all, which Camille had always appreciated. She was 58, wore reading glasses on a chain, and had the quality that the best attorneys shared. She listened to the complete sentence before she formed a thought about it. They met the following morning. Camille brought the petition, a printed summary of the account history she had compiled overnight, and a manila envelope containing copies of her licensing agreements, filed chronologically, going back 8 years. Phyllis read through each document in sequence. When she finished, she set them in a neat stack and looked at Camille over her glasses. She said, "He filed in a hurry. That always leaves edges." Camille said she had also noticed that the restructured real estate partnership had a co-signatory she did not recognize. Phyllis said she would have a financial investigator begin tracing the account movements by end of week. She said, "What I need you to understand is that what he has done with these accounts, if it is what the documents suggest, constitutes fraudulent transfer of marital assets. Which means this does not end with what is in his petition. It ends with what a forensic audit finds." She said it without drama, the way she said all things, as a statement of what was true. Camille said, "How long will this take?" Phyllis said, "Long enough to do it correctly." Real power operated in quiet rooms. She drove from Phyllis's office to her Uncle Bernard's house in College Park, the house where her father had grown up and where Bernard still lived with the particular stillness of a man who had outlasted most of his urgencies. He was 73, a retired postal inspector, and he had the habits of mind that profession produced: an attention to patterns, a suspicion of the obvious explanation, a preference for documented fact over spoken assurance. She sat in his kitchen and told him about the petition and the missing accounts and what Phyllis had said. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. Then he said, "Warren came to see me in January." She looked at him. He said Warren had come ostensibly to visit and had asked, in the casual sideways manner of a man who believes his subtlety is working, whether Camille had any family assets she might have access to in a divorce situation. Bernard had told him he was not aware of any such thing and had changed the subject. He said he had not called her because he had not wanted to trouble her on a suspicion. She thought about her father, who used to say that a person who asks the wrong questions has already told you everything about what they intend. She thanked her uncle and drove home. 3 days passed. Camille went to work. She sat in her office and reviewed brand briefs and responded to client emails, and attended a Tuesday afternoon meeting in which she gave feedback on a visual identity package with the same focused attention she brought to every project. No one at that table would have known that she had spent the previous evening cross referencing account statements against a calendar of Warren's business trips, finding for the third time that the dates aligned in a way that was not coincidental. She noted it. She added it to the folder. She drove home and made dinner and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, looking at the shelves she had built, thinking about what her father used to say about people who underestimated you. She was grateful now for every year Warren had spent underestimating her. By Friday, Phyllis's investigator had returned the first findings. The real estate partnership restructuring had been executed with a forged signature on one of the transfer documents. Camille's name rendered in a hand that was close, but not correct, on a form dated 14 months prior. The co-signatory on the restructured entity was a shell company registered in a different state, whose registered agent address matched the personal address of Warren's accountant. The drawdowns from the joint brokerage account had moved through 3 intermediate accounts before landing in a personal account in Warren's name that had not appeared in the divorce petition's asset disclosure at all. The total diverted from marital assets over 22 months was $318,000. Phyllis's office filed the amended response to the divorce petition that same afternoon. The response included the forensic findings, the forgery documentation, and a formal motion for full financial disclosure and asset recovery under Georgia family law. It also included, as an exhibit, a summary of the licensing portfolio Camille had built independently over 8 years, the current annual income it generated, and the total valuation her accountant had prepared. It was the first time those numbers had appeared in any document connected to Warren Reese. Camille went home that evening and cooked dinner and ate it quietly at her kitchen table, in the light of the open shelving she had built herself, and thought about what it meant to have spent a decade making herself small in a space she had actually filled completely all along. She was done making herself small. Freedom was the real currency, and she was liquid. The amended response reached Warren's attorney on a Monday. By Wednesday, Warren had called twice. She did not answer either call. She let Phyllis's office manage all communication, which was what attorneys were for, and why she had kept one for the past 11 years on a retainer he had never known about, and would not have understood the purpose of if she had told him. Warren's attorney requested an emergency conference. Phyllis attended on Camille's behalf alone. Camille stayed at her desk and worked through a brand brief for a client in Nashville and let the law do what the law was designed to do when it was given complete information. The conference yielded an acknowledgement from Warren's attorney that the asset disclosure in the original petition had been, as the attorney phrased it, incomplete. Phyllis reported this to Camille in a single sentence. Camille said, "I expected that," and went back to the brief. What followed next was not drama. It was documentation. It was the slow, methodical work of forensic accounting meeting family law in a conference room where no one raised a voice, because there was no need to. The numbers spoke with the authority that numbers always carried when they had been correctly assembled and properly attributed. Warren's attorney grew quieter at each session. Warren himself, Phyllis reported, was growing difficult to reach even by his own legal team. What followed over the next 4 months was not a divorce proceeding. It was a forensic accounting. Warren's attorney requested continuances twice. The forgery finding was referred to the district attorney's office for review. The shell company was dissolved after its registration was challenged. The $318,000 in diverted assets was the subject of a recovery motion that Phyllis pursued with the focused patience of someone who understood that the law moved slowly, but moved entirely in the direction of documentation. The settlement that was ultimately executed looked nothing like the document Warren had filed in March. The furniture and the $4,200 he had left her were reclassified as partial offset against the marital asset recovery. The licensing portfolio remained entirely hers, as it had always been, having been created and held outside the marriage from its inception. The Decatur house went to her on the asset split, its equity representing the largest single cash component of the settlement. Warren retained his personal accounts, diminished by the recovery, and the criminal referral for the forged signature hung over his professional life like a weather system that had not yet decided what it was going to do. He signed on a Thursday afternoon in a conference room on Peachtree Street, in the presence of both attorneys and a court reporter. Camille was at the table. She had dressed that morning the way she dressed for client presentations, carefully and without excess, in the charcoal blazer her father had told her made her look like someone who had already made up her mind. She sat with her folder in front of her, and her hands resting quietly on top of it, and she watched Warren sign each page with the expression of a man absorbing something he had not, despite all available evidence, quite believed would arrive. She did not speak directly to him. There was nothing she needed to say in that room that a document could not say more precisely. When the last page was signed and the court reporter had confirmed the record, Warren looked across the table at her once. She met his eyes and held them for a moment without expression. Then she looked away. There was nothing there that still required her attention. She gathered her copies and thanked Phyllis, and walked to the elevator and rode it down to street level, and stood in the afternoon light on Peachtree Street. In the particular stillness of a person who has finished something large and is letting the weight of it settle before the next thing begins. She was done. 22 months later, Warren Reese was in New York City for a commercial real estate conference. the kind of mid-tier industry event he attended to maintain visibility in a professional circle that had grown cooler toward him since the civil findings had become part of the public record. He was walking north on 7th Avenue on a Tuesday morning, coffee in hand, moving with the slightly diminished stride of a man who had adjusted his expectations of himself downward without fully acknowledging the adjustment. He stopped at the corner of 45th Street because the pedestrian signal was red. The morning crowd compressed around him at the curb, the particular density of a midtown sidewalk during the working hour, and he stood in it the way people stood at crosswalks, looking forward without quite seeing anything. Then, he looked up. The billboard occupied the full north face of the building across the intersection. 4 stories of illuminated vinyl in the colors that had become, over the past 18 months, instantly recognizable to anyone who had walked past a retail window, or opened a magazine, or waited at a bus shelter in any of the 14 cities where the campaign had been running. It was a national lifestyle brand. The kind of company whose identity had been failing quietly for years before someone rebuilt it from the concept level up. And the rebuild had been visible and total, and it generated the kind of industry conversation that made other brands take notice and reach out. The creative concept was spare and striking. The brand language at the bottom of the image was 4 words. Those 4 words were on everything now. Camille had written them in her home office in Decatur on a Wednesday evening, sitting at the desk she had positioned under the window for the afternoon light, with a cup of tea going cold beside her keyboard. In the unhurried, purposeful way, she did all her best work. She had written 12 versions before she arrived at those 4, and she had known immediately that they were correct, the way she always knew, and she had forwarded them to the client with a note that said simply, "I think this is the one." It was the one. The licensing agreement she had signed generated quarterly payments. It generated them whether she was at her desk or in her garden or sitting on her back porch in the evening watching the light change. It generated them on Tuesday mornings in late autumn when she had no particular reason to think about Times Square or the man who had once left her a checking account with $4,200 in it and called it a settlement. Her name was not on the billboard, but Warren Reese knew her face. He had woken up next to it for 9 years. Camille looked out from 40 feet of illuminated vinyl with the composed, unhurried expression of a woman who had been asked to sit for a campaign photograph and had simply looked at the camera the way she looked at everything, steadily, without performance, as if she had already accounted for all the variables and found them entirely manageable. The light changed. The morning crowd moved around Warren and past him and on up the avenue. He did not move with it. He had left her with $4,200 and a car. Some things, when they finally arrived, did not require a word. 14 months after that morning on 7th Avenue, Camille sat on the back porch of the Decatur house as the evening came in low and gold over the garden she had put in the previous spring. She had planted lavender along the fence line and a row of raised beds along the south wall where the light was best, and the garden had the settled, purposeful look of something tended by someone who understood that good things required consistent attention and were not in a hurry about it. Her licensing portfolio had expanded in the past year to include 2 new brand partnerships, one of them the largest single agreement she had signed, and her accountant had revised the annual projection upward 3 times since January. She had hired an associate, a young woman named Priya, who had the same quality of focused attention that Camille valued above every other professional trait, and the work had grown in the quiet, compounding way that good work always did when it was left room to breathe. There was a man named Andre who appeared in her evenings occasionally, a landscape architect she had met through Bernard's neighbor at a Sunday dinner 6 months ago. He was deliberate and unhurried, and asked about her work with the genuine interest of someone who understood what it meant to build something from a concept into a physical reality. He sat with her now on the porch steps with his own coffee, reading present without demanding. And she had grown comfortable with the particular quality of his company, the way she had grown comfortable with everything she had chosen for herself in the past 2 years. Gradually, on her own terms, without apology. She had heard from Phyllis that Warren's commercial real estate license had been suspended, pending the resolution of a separate civil complaint filed by a former business partner in the spring. Brooke had relocated to Savannah. The Thursday poker group he had hosted for years had dispersed. His mother had stopped returning his calls, according to a mutual acquaintance who had mentioned it without intending to reveal anything. Camille had noted all of it and released it, the way you released freight once it reached its destination. It was no longer her shipment to track. She held her coffee in both hands and looked at the garden in the last of the evening light, at the lavender swaying slightly along the fence line, at the raised beds she had built and filled and planted herself, at the yard she had chosen and tended and made into the particular thing she wanted it to be. She thought about her father, who had believed that the ability to see something clearly was the most useful skill a person could develop, and who had also believed that a person who had been underestimated was sitting on an advantage they had not yet chosen to spend. She had spent it. She was free. She was solvent. She was unbothered. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.